Americans who have lived abroad, biggest reverse culture shock upon returning to the U.S. Story 1 lived in Russia for 18 months. This was over 10 years ago. When I came back to the U.S., I spent a week in NYC and was taken aback at how nice everyone was and how shitty the subway is. Story 2 returned to the U.S. from India. Sat down to eat at a restaurant at the airport, and the waiter immediately brought me a glass of ice water. It took me a moment to realize that this was safe to drink here. Story 3, the massive amount of advertising and upsells. As soon as you get on a plane back to the U.S., it's all sign up for this credit card and watch these ads before and after the safety briefing, and you can pay later for all this. No payments today. It absolutely screams into your brain at every opportunity. Story 4, coming back to the U.S. from Cairo. It was not needing to be so alert all the time. There's a lot to like about Cairo, but it is a tourist city, and a lot of the businesses and locals take advantage of the tourists. It's a little thing, but you have to be ready to argue vehemently about every price and service. I didn't realize how much that was stressing me until I came home. Story 5 returned to the U.S. from Korea. It gets talked about all the time, but just how unnecessarily complicated and inconvenient our healthcare system is. To go from a system where you can go see a doctor specialist any day of the week without an appointment, to know you will be covered, and to have the peace of mind that you'll spend probably less than 20, to then go to whatever we have here, it's just absurd to me. I also pay twice for my healthcare here than I did in Korea. We are so duped for a system that is openly robbing us and not keeping us well. Story 6 moved from Singapore, then back to the U.S. 3 biggest shocks. 1, unlike Singapore, I can't expect everyone to know English in California. 2, an American striking a random conversation is normal. 3, Mexican food is the most American food around. Story 7, flying from Shanghai back to Dallas was the biggest culture shock for me. Shanghai makes Dallas look like a ghost town, and the maglev train that runs over the city gives you a sense of scale like no other. Imagine being in a jet flying over a city that just seems to never end. Story 8, after living in Korea and Japan, I will always forever appreciate the independence individualism of American culture. Especially in Korea, it felt like I joined gang cult when I realized even the simplest of tasks require the consensus of the entire office. I saw a 46Y. I'll feel like he didn't have enough authority to paper in the printer, so we had to wait and ask the office superior hours later. It's hard to describe in a small post. I just feel like there's a certain kind of autonomy that exists here that doesn't exist over there with regards to work. Story 9, after returning from living in India, I woke up parched one morning and realized that I didn't have any bottled water in the house. I got all distressed because it was early and stores weren't open, and it was cold and dark. Imagine my joy when I remembered I had potable water flowing into my house. Story 10, having to drive everywhere. Dublin isn't the most bike-friendly place, but living there for several years and being able to hop on my bike and get across town in 20 minutes is something I will always miss. After being back in Illinois for 2 years, I still hate that I have to drive 2 miles to Target, BC. That's the only option for getting there and home in 1 PCTA. At no point did I say I live in Chicago. I don't have city public transit and resources. Thus my comment. Story 11, had a layover in Salt Lake City on my way home from living in China for 6 months. How did all these people get permission to have so many children? All right. Story 12, the scam that is the for-profit healthcare system in the U.S. Truly pathetic that the richest country in human history can't provide universal coverage for all its citizens, medical bills, medical debt, insurers deciding which procedures you really need, doctors and hospitals being in out of network. All foreign concepts to most developed countries. We talk a lot about freedom in the U.S., but it's usually about positive freedoms, i.e. the freedom to own a gun, but we forget about negative freedoms, the freedom from something such as medical debt, student debt, etc. In that sense, we lack many basic freedoms enjoyed by other countries. Story 13, coming back to the U.S. after living in Japan for 7 years. Everyone seems so angry and selfish all the time. Public places like parks, streets, restrooms are just a disgusting mess that no one takes care of. Also, groceries were super cheap and fresh. I could get a week's worth of groceries for a family of 3 for around 10,000 yen. That's not possible in the U.S. Story 14, in the U.S. If I suggest we walk the 5 blocks to our destination on a beautiful, sunny day, it met with incredulity, outrage, and a glare appropriate for puppy torturers. Walking as transport is, apparently, a sign of homelessness and failure at life. Story 15, tipping. I lived abroad for a while, and my first day back in the U.S., I just genuinely forgot to tip a bartender on a single beer, and she told people at the bar that I stiffed her. It's such a ridiculous system. Story 16, how everywhere in the world has to pay attention to what happens in the United States. But people in the U.S. don't have a clue about anywhere else. I doubt 1 in 100 could name the president of Mexico. For instance, edit the number of people proudly defending their ignorance is rather striking and just proves the point. Story 17, the lack of public gathering spaces. I tried sitting on a bench for more than 5 minutes in a park, and a police officer came to check up on me. Edit to me, he acted hostile while asking for some more information. Story 18, pharmaceutical commercials on TV, was the most shocking. Smiling, happy people talking about taking a pill to counteract the pill they were taking for insert issue. Side effects may include mass murder, jumping from bridges, and uncontrollable diarrhea. At least you'll be smiling while you deal with all the side effects. Story 19, the food. Lived in Canada from 2006 to 2014. You don't really notice it going the other way, but coming back, holy, everything is loaded with salt and sugar. Everything, it is jarring. I gained over 20 pounds my first year back. I get that people do not want to hear this because we all love our Dino nuggets and cheap frozen pizza. But they really are trying to kill us with our food. At the very least, they truly do not care if they kill us, so long as the profit margins are high. Related to that, the sheer number of truly obese people, kids in particular. I lived in Toronto, and it was incredibly rare to see a person who clearly weighed over 300 pounds, like maybe once a year. Coming back, it was just shocking how big the average American had become. I pretty much lay that at the feet of the food thing. Story 20, I lived in South Korea for a few years. When I returned to my hometown, St. Louis, very little had changed. You can't walk anywhere in St. Louis County, and for the first time, that fact really got to me. My friends are also very sedentary and incurious, not wanting to go anywhere. I would go to a friend's house, and they just wanted to watch Netflix. And I was so used to being a very active person. Lastly, when anyone asked me about Korea, they couldn't help but slip in a racist joke or two. I had changed overseas, but my hometown didn't. Story 21, getting yelled at and herded around like cattle by U.S. Customs and Immigration as soon as I arrived back home. It's a huge shock to see how everyone with even an ounce of authority in the U.S. acts after being abroad where you're treated like a human. Story 22, I lived in Japan for a year. Coming back to the States made me realize how dirty it is here, and people are lazy and disrespectful when it comes to taking care of the city and each other. In Japan, it's a collective effort. Public restrooms are clean. If you have trash, you put it in your pocket or purse and hold on to it until you can find access to trash can. Here, people will drop it on the ground because they cannot dare to be inconvenienced. I've seen people at stoplights open their door and leave bags of McDonald's trash on the street and drive off so they can have a clean car. Of course, one of the first public restroom experiences when I came back home was in a store where there was a drainage grate in the floor and a woman had her kid taking in the grates instead of the toilet. And don't get me started how if they even have the sniffles, they wear a mask in public to be courteous. But here people like to cough directly into the wind. Story 23, not being able to just go to the doctor when you feel sick or notice something wrong. In Taiwan, you just rock up to the hospital, pay a US 6 registration fee, tell the registrar what ails you, get sent to whichever department fits your symptoms, wait for an hour or so, and see a doc. Government health care to the yeah. It's not communism, Americans. Story 24, coming back from Germany, Europe, and the customer service at U.S. restaurants was so intrusive and annoying. You cannot just sit and enjoy a meal with someone. You're constantly interrupted while talking. And while mid-chew, how is everything? Doing all right? Can I get you another drink, etc.? I get that some people like this type of service because they're used to or expect it, but it annoyed me to know and how the server constantly interrupted my meal. Edit nothing against the servers themselves. They're just doing their job. I wouldn't show my annoyance with someone trying to help me. It's more annoyance with the culture that this is an expected, normal kind of service. Story 25, coming back from Norway, I was shocked at how little paid time off Americans get. Had to readjust to the whole living to work mentality instead of working to live. Still bugs me. Story 26, lived in Baden-Württemberg, Germany. When I returned, I realized how awful our bakeries are. Also, I realized how much grass we mow around public roads. In Germany, they just let it grow out. Story 27, the difference in how the food affected my whole body in a positive way after being away from the U.S. for almost 2 years. My wife and I both had physical withdrawals when we arrived in South America from the difference in the food for at least the first 2 weeks. Couldn't figure out at first until our bodies adjusted. Both immediately lost weight without trying, and our whole physical appearance changed for the entire duration in a very positive way. Never felt so good in my life. After a few months back in the U.S., it all came back no matter how good we tried to eat. It was very eye-opening to say the least. Edit typo. Story 28, visiting a grocery shop and feeling overpowered by the sheer number of possibilities available for each and every item. How many varieties of ketchup do we actually need? Really? Story 29. I was in Japan for a semester. I landed super late in Chicago, so my folks weren't able to pick me up, and I took a car service instead. While driving home, the driver asked me where ID come from. I told him Japan. He proceeded to spend the next 15 minutes talking about how dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the greatest thing the U.S. has ever done. I'd been to Hiroshima while abroad and didn't know what to say in response to any of it. I was young, jet-lagged, and had fallen deeply in love with Japan, so I just let him talk and change the subject. When we got to my folks' place, he angrily asked if I was in a tip. I had like $5 on me, so I handed it to him and went inside, still the biggest culture shock I've had in my life. And yes, he was a boomer. Story 30, the lack of respect when it comes to noise. Even just on a train here, someone will be talking on their phone, so everyone else can hear. Or in a shop, someone will be having conversation on the phone instead of just minding others' personal peace. Story 31, I grew up in the U.S., but have spent my whole adult life in the U.K. and Austria. There's so many unique or nearly unique things about the U.S. Everything in the U.S. is huge. I'm in the U.S. this week and just visited a friend in Chicago. She was apologizing for a cramped flat, but it was palatial by middle-class Western Euro standards. Only thing we've got on Americans in that department is super high ceilings. It applies to food too, of course. I just saw a pack of Reese's Cups at Target that was more than a meter high. Diabolical. Lots of stuff is super sweet when it shouldn't be. Coffee, bread, sauces. It's kind of icky once you start noticing it. Especially in Austria, shops and offices have very limited hours by comparison. I forget this sometimes and find myself planning around not being able to get anything on Sundays or after about 19:00. Tip culture, as it is in the States, wouldn't be tolerated in Austria. The UK is slightly closer to the American model, but not much. They're quite forward in asking for it. It should, of course, be given, but it ought to be presented like a choice. I own no gun signs on business doors. That is a stark reminder when you've been away. This probably runs counter to the common narrative, but I find lots of Americans are quite rude in that they're not really aware of other people around them. Flying in this week, I was shocked by the fact that people just splay their stuff out on an escalator and block the path. You're supposed to stand on the right side and leave the left lane open for people in a hurry. There's also stuff like playing music out loud on buses and trains. This happens everywhere, but seems more common in the U.S. The amount of space given over to cars. There are so many parking garages. It's a ridiculous waste of space, and they're invariably ugly as sin. We have them in Europe, but not as many, and at least in the big cities, they're generally subterranean. Story 32, how poorly Americans dress. Massively oversized or sometimes undersized shirts, pants, graphic tees, sports jerseys, sweatpants, and hoodies everywhere. Coming back home from Scandinavia was eye-opening. I now buy clothes that actually fit and make an effort to not look like I rolled out of bed. Story 33, after many years in Europe, how many more overweight people there are, how many churches there are, how Americans assume everyone wants to hear their opinion, how little we value being informed or educated in order to have a strong opinion. Story 34, tipping culture. I spent several months in Latin America once, and in many countries. The tip is not only included in the bill, but tips are shared among servers. That meant that if I needed to order something or pay my bill, I didn't need to wait for my server. Any server in the restaurant could help me. Tax is also included in prices too. So what you see is what you pay. Story 35, America feels like a bubble on another planet. American culture just feels so separated from every other group of people on the planet, and the American zeitgeist is very isolationist. Story 36, two things were hard to get reacquainted with. One was that I had to start driving every day again. The other was that Americans really are a special level of fat. Normal fat Americans look like spectacles to me for a few weeks, even though I'd lived here for most of my life. Story 37, I've reversed culture shock twice. First when I lived in France for about 5 years. Then when I returned to the U.S. for a few months last year after living in the U.K. for a decade. Normal things really. Everything is huge, especially roads, shopping centers, and parking spaces. The most absurdly thing that has grown in size, supercab trucks and SUVs. What sort of shitbirds drive these things who aren't using them for work utility? It's cliché, but true to be blunt, Americans are fatlards. Tipping culture had gone thermonuclear since I've left. Commercials are hilariously stupid and really accord. Hard to describe, but they just have this sheen of bullshit and cheese. Everything is commercialized to the hilt, and just seems fake as I'm glad I'm back in the UK. TBH. Story 38, I left the US 14 years ago to live in France, and return once a year to see family. It always takes me a few days to adjust to the signature casual, friendly nature of Americans in public places. Also, I always forget that I could do errands like grocery shopping on Sunday. while I'm in the US. However, the biggest culture shock for me is how loud it is everywhere. People speak loudly. Music is loud in restaurants and cafes. Playgrounds are very, very loud. Inside voices in the US are outside voices in a lot of the world. It's not a judgment statement. I was used to it for a lot of my life, but I'm not used to it anymore. Story 39, I was only abroad for a month, and when I came back, the crudeness just surrounded me. Lack of civility, rudeness, disdain, I don't care-ness, not sure what to call it. Story 40, something I realized back in the aughts when talking to people was that the general education was on a lower level than, say, that of most European countries. Even things like college that people pride themselves on, I often found the foundations and understanding can be a bit detached and rudimentary in the US as compared with Europe. I left the US as a kid in the 80s, and when I started schooling at around 5 years in another country in Europe, I was reading a book a day and writing endless pages of flowing cursive shorthand script to get in as much deliberations and info as possible to the teachers, as that was usually what's expected of kids back then. I compare my schooling to some of my relatives who remained in the US, and it's like they never learned how to read or write very well despite being able to get a college degree. I found that when people are trying to read aloud, it seems like they aren't reading as much as trying to decode the letter combinations in real time. So they stumble over the words repeatedly, as if some foundational line of code was deleted by accident. They also don't seem to understand basic things like geography and natural systems, such as the water cycle, the interactions of the different types of resources in an economy, and so on. It seems like a lot of people just think that there's an infinite amount of resources and space out there. So there's less concerns around things like resource and waste management. I think most of that comes from a low regard for schooling and intellectual activity in general, despite being willing to toss a lot of money into the system. Then there's also things like homeschooling and religious schooling into the mix. The very individualist nature of the country allows people to live entirely detached from the rest of society and remain very shielded inside their own bubble. Oftentimes, when talking with a stranger, you can't expect there to be a shared sense of reality, leading to a lot of situations where what's considered normal behavior would elsewhere in the world be thought of as a rare occurrence of someone who's escaped a mental institution. Also, the kind of arrogance that comes with a culture of empire makes people overly confident of their situation and abilities, which is reminiscent of Britain and their colonial attitudes before the disintegration. What you'll actually find is that a lot of people will just crumble in the face of novel situations and difficulties. And so it's not the case anymore that there's a lot of brave and inventive educated people out there who will take on any sort of new challenge. Part of that could be remedied if people were actually able to learn what's going on in other places in the world and not just project their assumptions upon everything they see. Instead, it's a case of people shadowboxing with these assumptions and keep running into walls where it actually clashes with reality. I think that's going to be the main issue in the future, which is that the expertise may not be there to keep the U.S. running as it has been. A lot of early science education in particular was catapulted in response to the Soviet space military program. My family initially worked in the early computer industry on the west coast of the U.S. that was a byproduct of a lot of research connected to that, before we happened to settle down in Europe, because of a job opportunity due to having experience in these new industries and fields. Story 41, how ultranationalist it each has become, from the sheer number use of the U.S. flag to military recruitment in malls, the constant announcements for troops traveling through airports, how often we use the pledge and the anthem, the constant reminder that, yes, you are in the U.S. Story 42, I lived in Egypt for 3 years. My son was born in Egypt. I spent most of the pandemic in Egypt. I feel lucky to have been there because it wasn't as bad there as in America. Navigating the bureaucracy to get his birth certificate and extend our visa was an incredible exercise in patience. They don't have hardly any computers in the offices and everyone is smoking or having tea. You have to have WASTA to get anything done. I also lived in Russia for a little more than a year until just after Ukraine war started. Watching Russia roll out its Z campaign in real time was weird. 21st century Russian fascism was fascinating and kind of terrifying. All that said, coming back to the U.S. has been a challenge. I feel lonely as everything is so expensive. I have to drive literally everywhere. I just feel so depressed since coming home. My heart hurts for the Egyptian people. It's hard times there with corruption, inflation, and currency collapse, military dictatorship stealing from people, etc. Still, I want to go back. I miss it so much. Story 43, convenience in the U.S. is pretty great. In Europe, stores and restaurants close early. A lot of pharmacies have weird hours like only being open Monday and Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. It makes things really inconvenient if you need something. In the US, you can order food at 3 a.m. If you want. Grocery stores are open until 10 p.m. daily. Pharmacies and gas stations are open 247. Story 44 lived in Norway, Spain, Finland, and Sweden for extended periods of time. Biggest difference is everyone in the US is fat, especially the Midwest, where I'm from. Out west is a little better. Currently live in Utah. I think a lot of it comes down to car-centric cities as opposed to walking, massive portion sizes, and shitty quality food. Story 45. After living in the Marshall Islands, I was blown away by the nearly constant availability of potable water. Remembering that water fountains existed was ridiculously exciting. The other was ice, that it was also readily available and it didn't melt immediately. Story 46. Medical bills. I was in another country for 5 years, school then working, just stopped really thinking about it. Broken bone, fixed it, antibiotic for bucks maybe coming back was decades ago, and I'm still suffering culture shock. Story 47. After living in China and coming back to Houston, it was the size of the people, was still in the airport and really needed to pee. The hallway to the toilet was blocked by 2 women casually strolling side by side, and I remember thinking this would have taken at least 5 women in China to cover the same amount of space. Story 48. Didn't live in Europe, but I've been for long durations of time. How much Americans seem to fear others was really jarring to me, and I'm shocked this wasn't in the top comments. All the Finns and Icelanders I know seem to live their lives hardly worrying about anyone or anything going wrong, whereas Americans and Canadians are obsessed with crime and problems that are very unlikely to happen to them. It's a very trust no one, they could be criminals mindset that exists here. Story 49. I lived in Japan, Taiwan, and China the past 10 years, and came back to the States for the job and helped my wife with the immigration stuff. So for me, it was the overweight people. It seems there are many more people here that are obese than there were even 10 years ago. Restaurant food choices are boring. Bars here are kind of meh. The food and bar culture back in Taiwan and Japan are leagues above what we have found here in the States so far. We've been here for almost 2 years and are already actively looking for ways back to get visas in either Japan or Europe. And we've decided we don't want to raise our kid in a car-centric country and where you never see people and kids outside, just playing and being outside. Story 50. The number of things that are 11 out of 10 on the sweetness scale, and the number of products that contain high amounts of oil, even though literally no recipe would use any oil. Story 51. Having a gatekeeper physician doctor dictate when and what specialist doctors you can see. In South Korea, everyone is covered by the same national health insurance plan. You can visit any doctor at any time with the exception of a few specialists at major university hospitals. You would need a referral for that. Say I was having ear pain, I could visit any ENT clinic in the country. And if I didn't care for their treatment, I could go visit another. This whole system of having to get approval from your primary care physician first, and the sheer wait times to get an appointment. The whole U.S. healthcare is a horrific nightmare. Though certain treatments, surgeries, specialists, technologies may only be available in the U.S., but you'll never be able to afford most of it. Story 52. After moving back from Spain, lack of social gatherings seems to this day shocking. People here just do their own thing. I am lucky to have a few friends that I see once every few weeks. Story 53. It took me a long time to get used to grocery shopping again and the sheer number of choices available. It was option paralysis every time, an entire aisle of cereals, the juice aisle, the milk aisle, so many varieties of everything. In Africa, you were lucky if they had milk at all at the store, and you certainly wouldn't have to choose between whole, almond, or oat. To this day, I prefer small stores with fewer options, or I get overwhelmed. Edit, and by Africa, I meant Madagascar, an island off the southeast coast of Africa. I don't doubt that some parts of Africa have more options. Story 54. This will get buried. But I was in Thailand for 6 weeks in the 90s. A really good lunch was less than one. I came back, and a shitty sandwich, bag o' chips, and a drink was 10 or more. Ouch. Story 55. 1. How fat people are. 2. How profit-centric rather than patient-centric the healthcare system is. 3. How with no credit score. You can't do much even though I had credit cards with a total limit of 100K overseas. They don't care for how big the cars, SUVs, and parking spaces are. 5. How friendly people tend to be on the surface, but dig a little deeper, and they don't really care about you or your fate. Friendships are elusive. Story 56. Was stationed in South Korea for 2 years at the end of my term. Was a culture shock going into it. Definitely. Kind of wanted to stay on base more than I wanted to explore for the first few months I was there. But then once I started getting sick of being on base, I started to explore and really fell into the gaming community that South Korea offers. I barely spoke Korean and even now have a low understanding of it, but people overwhelmingly communicated with me in English when they wanted to. For the most part, South Koreans are nice to me, but there was still a lot of hate for not only being a white guy, but also being a U.S. soldier. So coming back to SW Virginia after leaving the military, I felt like I was frozen in time. People weren't right on top of me. Involved in my life, no structure from the military. Not only did I leave the military, but I left another country entirely, where I lived in a very populated city, where I had found genuine interests and even appreciated my surroundings when I was clearly not welcomed more often than not. Coming home, I've never felt more lonely in my life. Friends had moved on and weren't really friends anymore, just acquaintances. Parents and family were welcoming, but distant. Went into big-time depression. I knew I was depressed, but looking back, that depression lasted for years. Just didn't realize at the time, and I still don't think I'm as happy as I was in the military. In South Korea, a decade later, I think people should visit and explore the world, but if you move away to a different country, coming back is going to be, the U.S. may not seem like it has a culture, but it does. And it's not even remotely close to a community-based culture. And not saying one is better than the other. It's just some cultures may fit your personality a lot better, and experiencing that, then losing it, will hurt your soul. Story 57, some from moving from Germany back to the U.S. one. Going from super fast cashiers at supermarkets and trying to keep up to super slow cashiers that have to stand and the store bagging for me. 2. Keeping right on die, Autobahn, and only go left to pass and being annoyed to slow to 120 campy 75 miles per hour going through cities to people passing on the right and having to set my cruise control so I don't do 83, things being more clean in Germany than the U.S. 4. Pedestrian-friendly areas in cities, sidewalk cafes, and taking time to eat drink out to cars everywhere, can't really walk anywhere, and being rushed when eating out after spending summers in Greece with family to going back. And this was a really small town 20 years ago one. Can hop on a flying dolphin hydrofoil to go neighboring islands towns super cheap and fast. Ferry boat service doesn't really exist where I live despite a large body of water. 2. Nothing is open in the afternoon. It is sort of very hot to everything open. 3. Taking time to relax and enjoy life. Swim every day, my aunt says, after every meal. Going for walks, relaxing in the shade all afternoon, to everything is rushed. Again, this was a small village for evening stroll. Everyone goes out in the early evening, 7 p.m., and just strolls up and down the waterfront. You talk to people and just enjoy life. Where I live, you find few people doing this. It helps that in the village there are restaurants, bars, and cafes along the waterfront too. And where I live, it is all park space or industrial. 5. Eating 2 meals, a light mid-morning breakfast lunch, and then a huge dinner around 10 p.m. The dinner lasts hours. Here, 3 meals with an early dinner. Story 58, how fat everyone was, how quickly everyone did everything, how impatient everyone was. It was like a whole nation of fat people, with everything sped up to double or triple the speed I'd gotten used to living at. Story 59, I lived in a Muslim country for 3 years, and 2 things shocked me upon my return to the States. 1, the massive cat dog food aisle options in the grocery stores, and 2, how overtly Christian our newspapers was, and still is. Story 60, I lived in Korea for 12 years. Here is a few things. 1, hearing English in stores, and initially just stopping to listen. 2, the insane cost of healthcare, not having single-payer healthcare or universal healthcare. 3, poor phone coverage, slow internet speeds, for people being proudly ignorant, not prioritizing education. 5, feeling like an imposter, like everyone would know that I hadn't been in the U.S. the whole time, and I barely knew what was going on. Story 61, lived in Australia for 2 years, and learned that most Americans lack the ability to laugh at themselves, and it's honestly sad. Relax, no one gets out of here alive. Story 62, everyone is so miserable. Strangers crying in their cars in traffic, people on the verge of violent outbursts at the grocery store, adults seemingly ready to commit homicide over children's sports games. Granted, I spend most of my time in Northern Europe these days. The emotional range is extremely limited here. However, people tend to be happy here. Even those that are not happy aren't on the verge of breakdown at the slightest inconvenience. Story 63, everything is stupidly sweet. Bread sucks, nobody has any manners, food sucks here, it's got stuff. It doesn't need to preserve it for too long. At least I didn't have to worry about random people trying to shoot me, because their feelings were hurt that day. Story 64, random people speaking to me everywhere. People saying good morning as I walk past them on the sidewalk. Grocery store cashiers wishing me a good afternoon. Strangers who work in my office building smiling or saying hello in the elevator. I felt like they were either trying to pickpocket me or maybe I had gum in my hair or something. Nope, just Americans. Story 65, coming from Japan. The level of rudeness from people working in service and just people working at the airport in general was the biggest thing at first. The extreme levels of obesity And some people also caught me off guard. Like you can of course find overweight people over there, but almost never the type that is so big they have to ride on scooters to move around or can't fit into a single seat. Story 66-1, higher anxiety levels and feeling of being in a constant hurry. 2, the startling amount of obesity. My brain had a reboot when I saw someone in a mobility scooter for the first time in years. 3, everything is sweet, and sweet things are too sweet for portion sizes. Story 67, how sugary sweet so much of the food really is here in the U.S. When I first was overseas Scotland, everything tasted bland. Adjusted to it over time to the point it wasn't bland anymore. Moved back home to the U.S., and the majority of food tasted extremely sweet. You could easily taste all the added sugar. Story 68, stores. How much just stuff we have available at all times. And I was in Europe, not some country where most folks are poor. We just have so much unnecessary junk. Story 69, came back from Europe last year and noticed 3 things. Barely anyone smokes cigarettes in the U.S. in comparison to Europe. Granted, I see more vaping, so still unhealthy I suppose, but cigarettes smell worse, and the scent clings to you. U.S. has a much more fast-paced and stressful lifestyle. Go, go, go mentality. A lot more cars and larger portion sizes in the U.S. Story 70, after living in Germany for 11 years, every time I go back to visit the US, everyone is so talkative and friendly. Not to say Germans aren't friendly, but talkative, they are not. Story 71, coming back from Australia. 1, how bad the food quality is. The same brand of snacks tastes completely different. Produce is on a whole other level there. 2, it's crazy how relaxed everyone is when their country provides them free health care. America is always go, go, go. 3, the smaller the country, the better the customer service is. 4, can't get anything done on Sundays. 5, miss the extreme diversity of food, people, culture in America. 6, the infrastructure in America is so bad. Not having trains to easily get you places makes things so difficult. Story 72, everything is so covered in cars. So much space dedicated to parking. In the time it takes to walk from one end of the Walmart parking lot to the other, you could have passed through a vibrant, winding, cobblestone city center with dozens or hundreds of shops, restaurants, and things to do. Instead, we need space for everybody that could possibly fit in the store to put their 2-ton boxes of metal, plastic, and rubber so they could buy a few bananas, a TV, and a vibrating in the same soulless store.